Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. You have heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. A gentle answer turns away wrath. These are familiar and beloved commands from Scripture, but in the same Bible, we also read, "At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. 'Shout louder,' he said. 'Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desire. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves.'" Okay, how on earth do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory examples with the command to love our enemies and speak with grace? It's a question that has really hounded me for some time now because I love satire. I love to read it. I love to write it. Mockery is powerful and an incredibly popular tool, especially in politics these days. Now, some might say it's even a crucial tool, but lately Christians have disagreed fairly sharply over whether the duty to love our cultural enemies, or to be winsome, as many have put it, precludes mockery and sarcasm and wit. Well, joining me today to help untangle that very important question is someone who's written a marvelous essay at Church Life Journal on just that question, using a historical example. Dr. Brendan Case is Associate Director for Research in the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. He's the author of The Accountable Animal: Justice, Justification, and Judgment, and co-author of Least of the Apostles, Paul and His Legacies in Earliest Christianity. His essay at Church Life is called Pascalian Mockery as Love of Enemy. Brendan, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks, Shane. It's great to be here.
Let's start with Scripture, because that's where I kind of introduced us. Do you share my basic instinct that there's a kind of first glance incongruity between the commands and the examples of the Bible, that there's some tension between love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you, be gentle and graceful in your speech, and you guys are a brood of vipers who should cut your genitals off? Yeah.
My personal favorite, I think, from the list you enumerated is Paul. Yeah, from Galatians 5, as I recall, with some advice to his opponents.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's well put. There's a sort of prima facie tension or potentially even at first glance contradiction between those two bodies of evidence. And that's an invitation, of course, for those who take the authority and inspiration of Scripture seriously to look for some kind of distinction, which might help us in reconciling them and uniting them with a more encompassing theoretical framework, which is in part what I was trying to do in that essay, is sort of articulate the sort of underlying theory that might help us reconcile the command on the one hand, the commitment to enemy love, and to letting go of anger and malice in particular in our dealings with our enemies, and also the need at points, I think, not just the permissibility, but the positive obligation at points to use even apparently harsh means of engaging with our enemies. So in special circumstances. I'd want to emphasize that last clause, of course, because I do think a lot hangs on this, recognizing that these are, if they're permissible and even obligatory, they're exceptional as well. Not meant to be normative at points, but never meant to be normal.
And we'll get into those exceptions, because I think that you do the clearest job of anyone I've read so far of distinguishing between times when we should be using mockery and satire and those tools, and then the times when we should be very gentle and winsome in our speech. And there's a good reason for that. But I want to really kind of back up and help my listeners understand what the Christian duty, prima facie is from Scripture with regard to our speech. Because we have this argument that happens between two parties where there's the kind of sharper elbowed Christian writers who will say, Elijah mocked the prophets of Baal, and Paul said, emasculate yourselves. It clearly, some pretty harsh, extreme language is permissible here. And the retort is often, well, you're not Elijah. You're not the Apostle Paul. You're not Jesus. So therefore, you don't have the warrant to do these things. And that always, struck me as more of ironically, it's kind of a rhetorical swat down more than an actual rationale. It doesn't really explain why it's okay for them to do those things other than just an appeal to authority. So help me understand what it means to love our enemies in our speech and to season our speech with grace.
Yeah. Okay. So, I think the place to start really, I guess I'm trying to understand, the application of the command to love your enemies to the ethics of speech and the ethics of conflict, cultural conflict in particular, is really to start with the command to enemy love itself, which is what generates the sort of interesting constraints on acceptable Christian speech, which we're debating. I think, and this is the reason it's an interesting debate, the one that's sort of developed in the last. It's been unfolding in successive waves for a number of years, of course, but I found the most recent iteration of it, inspired by James Wood, above all, it seems to be interesting, primarily because it has brought the issue of enemy love right to the surface in a way that has been less explicit, I think, in earlier iterations of the debate. And what's interesting is both camps, broadly speaking, to the debate accept an obligation to love our enemies. It's pretty hard not to if you're thinking as a Christian, because it's right there in the Sermon on the Mount, Yeah, so the question, I guess, really is fundamentally, what does that mean? What does it mean to love your enemies? And I guess, at a deeper level, what does it mean to love? The case of enemy love is a special application, you might say, of the more general admonition to love your neighbor as yourself, which Christ cites, of course, as a summary of the law in a couple of places, often alongside the command to love God above all. And the enemy is a particular kind of neighbor. Not all neighbors are enemies, of course, thankfully. Most cases in which we're called on to love neighbors, we have warm or at least neutral relations with them. And the question is how do you, maybe starting with those less extreme cases is helpful, actually. So the definition of charity, and here we're speaking about a fairly specific virtue, which is lifted up in a number of places in the New Testament. Charity is the old-fashioned translation of it from the Latin caritas, which is translating the Greek word agape. And I'll say I don't want to overload the words themselves unduly. There's a classicists sort of weep and gnash their teeth when New Testament scholars sort of try to load the words themselves with a lot of conceptual content. So, in the way that like C.S. Lewis did, right? So Agape means one thing very specifically. Philia is this other very specific kind of love, friendship, right? And then there's eros. Words don't really work like that, of course. And all of these words are used interchangeably in a number of contexts in the ancient world. But conceptually, I think we can identify a distinctive kind of virtue, which Christians were, if not quite unique in the ancient world, then at least highly distinctive in sort of commanding and socializing as sort of the dominant ethic for their community. And this virtue they typically described as agape. And it's a special kind of love, which Paul limbs rhapsodically, in 1 Corinthians 13, among other places. And it's a kind of love which is distinctive in being heavily weighted towards what I like to describe as the contributory dimension of love. You can think of love as a trait, which in my view kind of has two dimensions. So there's a sort of unitive form of love. Lewis actually is really good on this in the beginning of the four loves. He distinguishes between need love and gift love. Need love draws the beloved to oneself. It seeks union of various kinds with the beloved. Gift love is outgoing. It seeks the good of the other. And agape is sort of distinctive. The Christian notion of charity, the ethic that Paul seeks to inculcate in his converts, is distinctive in being very heavily weighted towards contributory love, really without regard. In a way, it's a kind of heedless love. That's the love of the father who sees his son, coming back apparently from the dead, having despoiled his estate and betrayed him, and who, the father runs heedlessly and throws himself on the son and doesn't even ask for an apology, just throws him a party. Is that so? The core of that kind of love that Christians are called to is described very well by the medieval theologian named Thomas Aquinas, who's a great influence on my thinking on these matters. And Aquinas said that to love is to will the good of the other. It's to seek to bring about good for another person. That's the essence of charity. And the issue of loving your enemies is complicated, right? Particularly complicated. The idea of, so what does it mean to will the good of the other when the other is an enemy? And I mean, one interesting issue actually, which I think is not addressed enough really in these debates, and which frankly I don't spend any time on that essay either, just because I didn't have space for it. But one interesting conceptual question is, what is an enemy? Actually, it's not obvious. That I think this is one very often. I think one of the things that's quite interesting actually about the resolutely winsome camp, as I described them, the sort of resistors of harshness, in public engagement, is that very often my impression is that they don't actually believe that very many people satisfy the category enemy. And you find this sort of move. It's really prominent, for instance, in Arthur Brooks's 2018 book, Love Your Enemies, which I recommend, and it has lots of good advice in it. It's one of the books I kind of use as a jumping off point in that essay. But he actually says quite explicitly towards the end of the book that the title of the book is a misnomer, because our partisan opponents, whatever your party affiliation or whatever your sort of ideological background, he said we shouldn't think of partisan opponents as enemies. They're the opposition. They're not the enemy. But life is short, I suppose, and we have to start somewhere. So, assuming we have a reasonably firm grip on what enmity is, the question is, at the very least, it's the enemy is someone who wills your evil in some sense. The enemy is someone who wants bad things for you, whether he knows it or not. The paradigm case is that he wills your evil as evil. Macbeth with Duncan say. It's a delicate operation psychologically, to love someone who wills you evil. Very often requires sort of psychologically overcoming your own resentment and anger towards that person, before replacing it with goodwill. But the reason that enemy love is so tricky in particular is that the enemy is very likely not to agree with you about what the good for him would be, right? At the very least, you're not going to, definitionally, loving your enemy means willing that he sees to will your evil, mm-hmm. right? And so the reason that enemy love is so complicated, I think, both to theorize and also to sort of work out concretely how you go about it, is that this is a case where the lover and the beloved are sort of as misaligned as it's possible to be in terms of their own perceptions, both of their own good and also of the relationship between that good and the other person. Yeah, so that I think, at a very high level, that's sort of the framing that makes this a complicated prospect. Loving the enemy in that case, at the very least, means wanting something for the enemy, which the enemy at present doesn't want for himself, at least not under the description that you would give it. And so there are lots of things. Concretely, I guess we can go on to talk about lots of things practically, loving the enemy entails, but all of them involve this sort of bid for conversion within the enemy. The enemy is set on by definition, from your point of view, is set on bad things. The enemy wants bad things for himself and for you, and you want him to want good things for himself and for you. You want him to want the good. And so that's why it's challenging.
Part of what makes this difficult is that enemy is a sort of loaded word. It's one of those militarized words that's typically used in the context of physical combat, right? You're actually trying to kill each other in order to accomplish a military goal. And the conversation we're having right now, Brendan, is not centered around that. It's mostly centered around sort of speech. It's the idea that we're having cultural engagement of some kind, or a political engagement, or an academic or theological engagement. And so the enemy, quote unquote, is the person across the table from us or across the aisle from us who has a different perspective and wants to order society according to that perspective, or order the church according to that perspective, and so forth. So the inimical nature between these two is much more on the level of spirit and mind than it is on the level of body. And that can complicate things in a lot of ways, not least of which because you're not defending yourself in a very straightforward sense. You're not trying to keep the Nazis from invading your country or liberate, another country they've invaded. You are simply in this instance trying to achieve a political outcome or an ecclesiastical outcome. So we record this hours after the Supreme Court announced the Dobbs decision, and Roe v. Wade and Casey, among other decisions, have been overturned, and the landscape culturally around abortion in this country has been radically altered. A lot of people on both sides of that debate for 50 years have looked at those on the other side as their enemies, as their cultural and political enemies. And so, and there's been a lot of, sort of harsh engagement back and forth on that front. And so if we adopt this category of enemy and we sort of strip it of its militarized conception, we recognize, lives are at stake in this particular issue, right? So it's not entirely inappropriate to speak that way. To will the good as Aquinas says, of the people on the other side is the definition we work with, as you're saying, for loving them. I want to move to how we can do that while also employing mockery, satire, and the rhetorical tools that we typically look at today in Christian circles as unwinsome, right? So we'll bring in this third word, winsome. And your article caught my eye primarily because of, first of all, the title. It's Pascalian mockery as love of enemy, not despite love of enemy or alongside love of enemy, but as love of enemy. So if you could kind of give me the summary of what's going on today, the contributors to this winsomeness discussion, and then walk us through the story of Pascal and his debate and what they had to do with each other.
A friend of mine named James Wood published an essay in First Things a couple of months ago now. The thesis of James's essay is we should stop caring so much about winsomeness, effectively. That's the people who have made a public commitment to it are consistently led astray by this commitment. In my view, there's really several. I mean, my essay, I think, only addresses really one strand of a pretty complicated and kind of interlocking debate, to be honest. So there's the stylistic or formal debate. Is it ever permissible to speak publicly as a Christian intellectual in ways that are not winsome, in harsh or mocking or satirical ways, right? So that's one strand of the debate. Another strand of the debate, which is relatively less articulated, I think, in James's essay and also in some of the responses to it, is substantive, though, and it concerns the ways in which a given intellectual's sort of public interventions are consistently directed. Who are they most worried about, right? So there's a substantive debate too, right? Whatever you think about the winsomeness question, right? I mean, James's real question has to do, I think, with the interaction of this formal commitment with another set of substantive commitments that these same intellectuals hold.
So, like, who are you trying to please?
Yeah, well, and I think, or I mean, to put it more positively, or I suppose to put it less pejoratively, who are you most worried about, right? So, I mean, I think I'm in a somewhat better position to judge the overall work of David French, for instance, and I do think my sense is that this is it's a consistent pattern on his part as well. Certainly since the advent of the Trump era in 2015 or so, to be much more concerned about the right and about developments on the right, bad behavior on the right, than about developments on the left, and to invest a lot more energy in seeking to oppose bad behavior on the right. There's not the same comparable level of concern or ire or energy invested in opposing bad behavior and lamentable developments on the left. And I don't want to paint French with too broad a brush either. I don't know him personally, but he seems like a really nice guy, and he's done great work on a lot of issues I care about over the years as well. I mean, including within the pro-life movement, But yeah, I do think that there's a kind of there's an aspiration. I mean, what French consistently portrays as his kind of core commitment is an aspiration to a kind of neutrality between left and right. He talks a lot about pluralism, say as a kind of the ethos that ought to govern our public engagements, and we should adopt a kind of live and let live attitude. And I think the way that these substantive concerns enter into James's essay is by way of this framework that Aaron Renn has recently proposed. The kind of three worlds of evangelicalism or Christianity in America. The
positive world, neutral world, and negative world. And so now we're in a world where Christianity is seen negatively.
Yeah. So a kind of style of kind of posture of public engagement, which made sense in a setting in which Christianity had a more neutral public presence. And I think, to some extent, it's useful to bracket the question of Christianity's implication in these questions too, because it's not as though the decision to even going back to Roe to legalize abortion on a national scale, or to revise marriage law as the Supreme Court has done in a number of prominent cases, in recent years. It's not as though these changes these changes would have been sort of radical social innovations in any number of religious contexts, not just Christian ones, right? I mean, to some extent, it's we're talking about the kind of the common sense of humanity writ large, not simply, which I mean is the common sense that Christians have rightly taken up in lots of cases, and Christians have their own distinctive reasons for being committed to that common sense. But in any case, that in the neutral world, that sort of pluralistic live and let live posture. Let's just be sort of resolutely winsome to all comers in the hope of winning. Let's be all things to all men, so that we can win some, right? That idea. The theory is that worked better in the neutral world. It doesn't work so well when the left in particular has become uniquely threatening. It's a contentious judgment, and I think, a lot of people, frankly, have misunderstood, have interpreted James as saying that as a kind of blanket endorsement of Donald Trump and all of his works or something like that. And I'm reliably informed that he's, James is not a Trump voter, or for what it's worth, I'm not either, and I feel quite discouraged about developments in both parties. But to arrive at the position that James takes in the essay, you have to pair both the stylistic or formal judgment, sometimes harsh words are okay and actually necessary, with a kind of substantive judgment about where you should be sort of most concerned, as you think about your public posture. So I think I thought of Pascal's intervention in this debate in the 17th century, which I'll say a bit about in a second, I guess, primarily in the context of the first element of the debate, the formal one, right? And I mean, I don't think there are some interesting substantive parallels as well, which I kind of very briefly, I opened the essay with this analogy between the Arnault affair and contemporary cancel culture, sort of,
the Jesuits are trying to cancel him.
Yeah, and so basically, what happens what happened was there's this in 17th century France, there's a group. There's lots of ongoing debates, as there have been forever, about the doctrine of grace, which at this point is very much a matter of public concern, and the state is very much involved, frankly, in the development of the debates and also in enforcing the outcomes of them. Along with the church. This is sort of the classic ancien regime, sort of throne and altar alliance. And so there's one group, a fairly marginal group, which Pascal found himself drawn into, they came to be called the Jansenists because of their allegiance to this guy Cornelius Jansen, who had a very kind of, I would say, dour interpretation of Augustine's theology of grace. A lot of his fellow Catholics called him a Calvinist, which he wasn't. But, in terms of the theology of grace, they're both, and sin, and election, both quite dour, I think. And this had spillover effects for how he thought about the sacraments. He thought that people were taking communion way too often and were probably endangering their souls by doing it. And he thought confessors were really lax. And anyway, they advocated this kind of rigorous, mode of Christian living. And they did so in print, publicly. They did so in French, too, which was also quite controversial. Theological debates were typically conducted in Latin, which, of course, nobody besides the theologians could read, And so when you start writing in French for a wider public, you raise the stakes, of the controversy. And he drew the ire in particular of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, who in that period were enormously influential within the church and especially within France. I mean, to cut a long story short, the Jesuits effectively orchestrated the condemnation of Jansen's opinions by the Pope and enforced a kind of renunciation of Jansen's views by his followers on pain of not just ecclesial, but also civil and even criminal penalties. And this included one of Pascal's friends, a guy named Antoine Arnault, who was a very famous philosopher in France at the time. He was a great supporter of Descartes, correspondent with Descartes. Arnault ended up being fired by the Sorbonne, where he had taught, and eventually ended up having to leave France. He went to live in the Netherlands as an exile because of the compulsion he was placed under over the course of about a decade. I mean, it was a long process. And so Pascal, in the midst, as that process was starting, as Arnault's trial was unfolding at the Sorbonne, Pascal wrote a series of letters called the Provincial Letters. They're written to a friend in the provinces. That's the style, sort of informing him about latest developments, in the capital.
It's kind of like most excellent Theophilus, most excellent friend in the provinces.
Yeah. And you won't believe what just happened. People here are absolutely insane. It's that sort of, this still happens today, right? People, yeah. I do this, I live in Boston. I do this somewhat regularly, with friends who don't live in Boston. You won't believe what I just saw on the bus. It's the craziest thing. And so it's kind of like in that spirit, but written again in France for a wide reading public. And the letters principally consist in a bitingly funny send up of the theology of the Jesuits, the kind of rival theology of grace and the sacraments and of confession, which is being opposed to his own preferred Jansenist theology. And a lot of it consists really in quotations from recently published works by noted Jesuits within the order, from that century in the last 20 or 30 years or so, with sort of lightly embellished, with sort of light commentary basically interspersed, or it's written in the style of a conversation, say between Pascal and the Jesuit, with the Jesuits' words mostly being taken from Jesuit works, primary works. And it's very funny. I mean, if even the bits I quoted, I think suffice to kind of give the flavor of it, but they're extremely, extremely funny. It's a very effective piece of
right. So like in one, I got to give it a couple examples. Like in one, he mocks this sophistical distinction the Jesuits are trying to, or maybe the Dominicans, I forget which one, were trying to make between sufficient grace and efficacious grace. And he's like, well, if it takes efficacious grace to do it, then sufficient grace was not sufficient. And then he gives someone who is willing to sort of say, if sins are committed in ignorance, then, God doesn't hold it against people. And he goes, the more ignorant you are, then the better off you are. So we shouldn't evangelize and hail to this, guy who takes the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, quoting John the Baptist. So yeah, it really is pretty outrageous. It's great.
No, it's great. Yeah. And I mean, the thing is, these are not, as far as I can tell, these are entirely fair representations of what actually was occurring, on the ground. Certainly, I mean, the second example you take is quoted directly from the work of this Jesuit father Boni, the Summa of Sins, published in 1630, which I mean, is out of print, obviously, but seems to be he's quoting verbatim, from it. So, and I think it's as you say, outrageous, and very funny and very effective, and what is you mentioned the Dominicans, who I haven't mentioned before, and one of the interesting things about the way the debate unfolds is that even though it primarily is opposing Jesuits and the Jansenists, there's this sort of third party who gets brought in as well, represented principally for Pascal by Dominicans, although I'm sure there were others, secular priests, and others involved as well, but who sort of effectively agree in principle with the Jansenists. Actually, they're much closer in substance to the Jansenists, but have sort of worked out these kind of this sort of uneasy detente with the culturally ascendant Jesuits, who and so they agree to use the expression like sufficient and efficacious grace, which to create formulas that they know the Jansenists won't be able to subscribe to, even though they have profound disagreements internally, but the Jesuits and the Dominicans do, about how to understand those. I mean, sort of they have totally irreconcilable interpretations of the formulas that they're propounding, and the Dominicans are actually much closer in substance to the Jansenists. But so the Dominicans represent a sort of a going along to get by kind of approach, to these issues. I hope I also conveyed in the essay, I do think one of the things that's impressive about the debate is that both camps really are very firm in their professed commitment, not just to enemy love, but also to the importance of resisting our cultural enemies by any appropriate means. And I think that French is clear that he's not I suppose the better analogy for the Dominicans in a contemporary setting would be sort of the center left, sort of liberals in the New York Times newsroom who like go along with their younger colleagues, shanghaiing of someone who has crossed, a suddenly appearing cultural line, Barry Weiss or whoever, this is, who sort of don't speak up, and are happy to kind of toe whatever the new line is in the hope that they'll be left alone, probably naive hope, frankly, that they'll be left alone. Yeah, and I think, that is unfortunately all too common today. I mean, it happens on the right too. Of course, there's plenty of the Trump era has offered an embarrassment of riches, and that examples of that kind of thing from well-meaning, once sort of anodyne conservatives who have suddenly discovered all kinds of newfound concerns with election security or whatever, in the wake of Trump's discovered that the election was stolen, say. That kind of thing happens on the right too, in spades. Well,
what's so interesting about this is that Pascal draws not only does he take this as an opportunity to go in and do some mockery of his own to declare his position, but then he backs up and does this reflective thing where he says, okay, the Jesuits are fussing about my use of mockery because they say it profanes sacred things, right? So here's a defense of mockery. And that's what's so interesting. And really, the heart of your essay is Pascal's defense of mockery as a thing that's compatible with and potentially even a vehicle for Christian love and charity towards enemies. So give us his defense and then how he kind of squares the circle on that apparent contradiction between, love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you and cut it all off, Galatians.
Yeah. So, what you're referring to is the 11th provincial letter. I can't remember how many in total, actually, 18 maybe, 17. And as you say, the 11th is a kind of pause. Up to that point, it had been mostly kind of first order debates with the Jesuits about the content of moral theology and about what they're saying and is it defensible. And in the 11th, he kind of takes a step back because he had received a number of objections, effectively all maintaining that he was being mean. Basically, the Jesuits are saying, hey, you're being mean to us. That's
you're
not fair.
Being winsome, Pascal.
You're punching below the belt, that sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. So he sets out 4 explicit criteria, effectively, for the licit use of mockery by Christians, as consistent with enemy love. I've added 2 implicit criteria, which I think he doesn't articulate, but I think are also sort of implied in his actual performance of mockery elsewhere for a total of 6. And I guess I could I don't need to.
Yeah, walk us through those, because for me, this unlocked a major difficulty because I really did see these 2 strains of things. And I think I am naturally bent in the direction of being okay with too much mockery, too much sarcasm and satire to the point where it becomes cruel. But Pascal really cuts a nice distinction between them. So walk us through the 4 that he gives explicitly, and then you can kind of add the 2 that you discern in his work as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the 4 criteria he outlines, as I take it, are so first, when charity mocks, is the way he puts it. How can charity engage in these kinds of behaviors? How can love of enemy sort of yield this sort of approach? And he says, well, first off, charity speaks only truths. So one of the things that's out of bound is lying or distortions of your opponent's position of any kind. That's easier said than done, of course, particularly in the context of mockery, which sort of is prone intrinsically to excess, And the best guard, I think, against it, which Pascal observes quite strictly, is use their own words when you can. So verbatim quotations are a really good thing to do if you can. The second, he says, is that charity doesn't speak every truth, but only the way he puts it, is only what discretion permits. And what he has in mind here in particular is that you should not make your mocking or satirical or harsh interventions personal, unless there's some absolutely pressing reason to make them so. Right. So if you're arguing with someone who's advocating a position that you think is reprehensible and dangerous, deeply wrongheaded, deeply contrary to the common good, attack the position. Attack it. Give it everything you got. And if the other conditions are satisfied, which we'll talk about, make it satirical, make it funny. Make them look ridiculous if you think their position is ridiculous. But don't, if you're arguing about some aspect of marriage policy, don't make it about their marriage. Don't make it about them. So he says, I'm talking. He had a whole long extended. The 10 letters prior are all about the sort of outrageous things that the Jesuits are saying in print, in his view. But he doesn't spend time, he says, talking about like Jesuit indiscretions. He's not talking about the sins or failings of particular Jesuit fathers. That's not what he's interested in,
So ideas, attack the ideas, not the people.
Yeah. Right. I mean, that would be the basic way of putting it. I guess I would want to qualify that a bit and say, something like that. That's except in cases where the debate itself makes some aspect of a person's character directly relevant to the issue. And this is the most salient case here, of course, are cases of sort of like gross public hypocrisy, which I think even there, it's not straightforward what to say about it. But, a politician who advocates fervently for position A, but then lives in a way that sort of is in flagrant contradiction to the position that he's articulating, he leaves himself vulnerable to that being pointed out. I wouldn't say in every case it's relevant. We're all hypocritical to some extent, right? And then the fact that you fall short of an ideal that you espouse is not necessarily it doesn't disprove the ideal by any means. So you have to be discerning even there. But as a general rule, Pascal has a pretty firm commitment not to bringing people into it. Talk about ideas, talk about the issue. Don't bring people into it. Yeah. So the third one is And this, I mean, I suppose this is intuitive, but mock, you only have license to mock what's evil. This is not a rule that anyone is apt to violate intentionally, I think. But I mean, I think what it does indicate is that this is the real insight that he's articulating here. I think maybe not as clearly as he could, is that this is not an everyday sort of device. This is not a device you should use casually, in conversation with your friends. There's a wonderful line. I can't remember what proverb it's from, but in the Proverbs, something to the effect of, like a madman shooting flaming arrows is the man who calls his brother a fool and then says he's only kidding. I do think this is what he's trying to ward against, is that, you shouldn't think that satire and mockery is an acceptable feature of everyday life, that this is the sort of thing you can just deploy with your friends, with your spouse, with your parents on a regular basis and expect to get away with it.
No, in fact, it will not be productive for any of those relationships you just named.
Yes,
it will probably
exactly, right.
decrease,
Right.
degrade relations between you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So use it only in cases of confrontation with grave evil, I think is the lesson here. Then the fourth explicit one is, effectively just stipulates that love of enemy needs to be a current, articulate part of the disposition of the person who's engaging in mockery. So the way he puts it is, you should always desire the salvation of those whom you're mocking, whom you're satirizing. I would want to say more broadly, you should will the good of those, including, of course, their ultimate good of those who you're mocking.
So if I'm mocking a pro-choice politician, like I should want them to, not only be saved, but also to come around to my way of seeing things, and then to be, an advocate for that cause of justice, right? I shouldn't want them to be destroyed or discredited or, beyond what their ideas merit.
Yeah. And I mean, I think even it's an idea that has broader application, though. I suppose your listeners will be a little ways out from it, but you and I are, just a couple of hours out from the release of the Dobbs decision. And I'm still, it's a sort of epic making moment, in American public life. And it's very understandable, I think, for someone who, is an ardent advocate for pro-life politics, to be not just sort of jubilant, but to have a kind of haughtiness in victory, I think, which vis-a-vis, our pro-choice opponents on this issue. Understandable, jubilation, I think, is totally defensible. I think it should be encouraged. No need to be ashamed about being very happy that this terrible court decision has finally been reversed. Any more than, nobody should have been rebuked for being really happy on the day that Brown v. Board was handed down too, overturning Plessy, right? These are terrible, terrible laws that need to go away. But, I think there's a temptation, though, to sort of look at pro-choice folks as people who are sort of, getting their just comeuppance or something like that, a lot of people are obviously feeling very upset today in this country, very upset, and many of them scared, many of them feeling kind of bewildered and at sea. And
so maybe breaking out my liberal tears mug today to drink coffee is not.
Yes, exactly. Don't carry that around. Yeah, certainly not if you live in Boston. Yeah,
right.
I mean, I think the thing to recognize is that these are people who, in my view, deeply erroneously, are seeking the good as well. Many of them, probably most of them, genuinely are people of goodwill, who are, mistaken, I think, at a profound level. But so the liberal tears mug, I guess, is a good example, right? These are, this is a case where it's not just that you should sort of desire them to become just like you, but you should recognize that in this case, if they lose, or if they experience setbacks in their own political priorities, and they grieve that their grief even is not totally misplaced, I guess is what I would say. To recognize that these are people who are grieving, in their view, the loss of goods that you also to some extent value. If you value the dignity and autonomy of women, and value the ability of parents to raise their kids in conditions of safety and health and plenty, and these are all things which pro-choice advocates care a lot about, and I think I think, it goes beyond just sort of wanting your enemy to be converted to your own views, although it's it's consistent with that, of course. I mean, obviously I wouldn't hold the views if I didn't think other people should hold them, but I think more broadly sort of recognizing, that these are people too, maybe is the way I would put it. They're not just sort of mouthpieces for ideas which you need to sort of rebut.
So there's two more here. That's very helpful. I like that. There are two more here that you kind of read into Pascal's own behavior in his writing. And it's interesting that he didn't make these explicit, because in my mind, these are kind of the most important of them for making some real decisions in your engagement about who are you going to mock? Who are you going to satirize? So give us those, because I really appreciated you discerning them.
Yeah, sure. And so I'll propose them. I mean, I think that they're, as I say, implied in Pascal. If that turns out to be wrong, they're still defensible, I think, on their own terms, I hope. But so the fifth and the sixth are that, so fifth, you should only use mockery in conflicts with those who are both powerful and unreasonable. That's what I put it. So no punching down or no bullying. But the two conditions are important. So on the one hand, Pascal's arguing, he decides to write these letters as a kind of last ditch effort to swing public opinion in favor of Arnaud. This is why he writes them, in French as kind of broadsheets, to be widely read. And he did that because there wasn't really any other recourse. There was a lengthy legal process that the Jansenists went through, but it was a kind of kangaroo court situation in which the issue had effectively already been decided by the Pope's decision to anathematize these propositions, which he extracted from Jansen's work. He's attacking a group who's enormously powerful, and not just powerful, but using their power in sort of unseemly ways. They're using it. They're being bullies, effectively. I mean, I think to put it, really bluntly. I mean, they're using it to, and of course, I mean, it's not, 17th century obviously was not a period in which anyone was yet offering sort of, anyone outside of a few kind of fringe Anabaptists and Socinians and folks like that. No one's offering at this point full-throated defenses of religious toleration on a societal scale or anything like that. That comes a little bit later, later in the century and certainly in the 18th century. But so, I don't mean to hold the Jesuits to a sort of unreasonable, anachronistic standard, but Pascal thought that they were abusing their authority. This is not how you should engage in disagreements with your ecclesial rivals by sort of tapping the Pope, to swat them down. It's the kind of thing you do when you've lost the argument. I think is his view, and you're not willing to concede it. You do this in cases, and I think at least what we see Pascal modeling is the use of satire in cases where you're dealing with an opponent who's both stronger than you and also using that strength in sort of irresponsible ways to harm you or to harm others. Those are very specific, and they're pretty exacting criteria. But I mean, in my view, they're met all over the place. Honestly, today, I mean, I think it's not at all uncommon to find you have enormously influential individuals or professional bodies, governmental agencies, which have chosen to sort of exact their will on people who don't have the power financially, legally, to defend themselves against them. And in that case, I think this is a case where, assuming all the other conditions can be met, satire and mockery is fully justified. The fifth and the sixth are, on the one hand, an authority who's stronger of you, and then the sixth is that he's not responsive. An irresponsible authority gives us our combined fifth and sixth constraints.
These are, I almost think of Augustine's just war doctrine. So there's justice in war or justice, to war and justice in war. So the reasons the causes that you have for going to war that are just, and then there's how you conduct yourself as a nation in war. This is kind of like a just war doctrine of satire and mockery. It's like, here are the reasons you go into this mode of engagement, and here are the ways in which you conduct yourself justly. And it seems like your two implicit rules are kind of the reasons you can go into it, and even who you can engage. Like, it can't be punching down to an inferior. It can't be grinding someone into the dust who already has no recourse. It has to be this kind of posture of appealing to basic common sense and humor in order to reveal the ridiculousness of someone who's very powerful. And I love the second one, who's unreasonable, who's not willing to play the game of real, reasoned engagement with you, good faith conversation, who is actually just trying to put their finger on the scale and create an injustice. And at that point, you appeal to the humor of the common man. And that's kind of what Pascal is doing here, which is what makes it such a good model in my thinking.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It should, I think the sixth condition, what it suggests is at minimum that this should never be your first move, in a disagreement. This is not how you should start a conversation with someone you disagree with, The initial invention should be winsome, I suppose. along the lines of, I think we're in agreement. Both camps are in agreement there that you should start out on the assumption that people you're talking to are open to persuasion or are reasonable people, and on a long enough timeline. And again, I don't know if there's any way of specifying what the sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for saying you've crossed a threshold. But on a long enough timeline, there are debates though in which you sort of realize that no, actually, this is not about the evidence anymore,
I just spoke with Ryan Anderson on his and Alexander De Sanctis' new book, Tearing Us Apart, How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. And I picture him, as kind of on the marriage issue and the abortion issue, really just this extremely winsome, extremely careful, extremely sincere advocate for his viewpoint. And I've watched over the years, especially back before Obergefell, for instance, where he went on. What was the talk show where he went on, and it was one of these liberal hosts, and they kind of sat him down almost in the seat of the defendant, right? And they're towering above him, and they're looking down, and they're like, he explains his position, and they're like, that's nice. Why are you a bigot? Why do you hate gay people? And it's just sort of a immediate go to the false accusations and a refusal to treat him as a good faith interlocutor. And at that point, he doesn't, because he's chosen, I guess it's a strategic move to just be sincere and straightforward and to keep repeating the reasoned arguments no matter what. But at that stage, there definitely is, in my mind, an opening where you say, look, if you're going to not listen to my arguments and respond in good faith, and you're just going to call me names, then at that point, you are that bully. You are that more powerful opponent who sort of deserves to be mocked. And I think there are probably those who are called to do that and those who are not. But that seems like an opening to me. And it seems like a real world example as well.
Yeah, I'm a tremendous admirer of Anderson's work. I'm looking forward to that book too. I haven't read it yet, but and I think you're right that he's definitely someone who has an enormous appetite for public sort of punishment. He can just what he's able to absorb, is goes far beyond what I think you could reasonably ask of most people. And I think it's absolutely true, that there are. I think you're right to say that there's a real division of labor, an important division of labor within any movement between people who are sort of called to sort of continue making the reason case, ad nauseum until you do eventually find people who are willing to hear it. And you need someone to continue making the Anderson style, sort of patient interventions, because on the assumption that the lampooning is successful, you have to have something positive to offer in its place. You can't subsist on satire alone, right? Satire is a kind of negative, is a negative device.
Well, that's the sort of last question I want to ask you here, because we're getting to the end of our time. What success looks like with mockery and satire that's done in love and as love. So when the person that you're talking with or you're lampooning or satirizing essentially says, all right, you got me, my position's ridiculous. What next? What does a productive use of that look like where you haven't actually degraded someone, but you've loved them?
Yeah. Well, look, I'll say too, in the ordinary case, satire is aimed typically at persuading not the object of the satire, right? But other people. That's typically the case. In the case of Pascalian mockery, that's sort of definitionally the case, because the satire is premised on the fact that your opponent has sort of ceased to be responsive to what you take to be good reasons, And so, Pascal is playing here not in the Provincial Letters. He's playing principally not for the Jesuits, but for other people, who are tempted to go along with the Jesuits. He wants to convince them to see that that the emperor has no clothes. That's the ambition initially. So, success, I think, in the ordinary case, will be the winning of hearts and minds, among the public, whom both sides are playing for. I mean, what that looks like in a given case, I suppose, will vary. But yeah, you do mention, of course, a loftier ideal still, which is very nice to contemplate, which is that the satire actually succeeds in changing the mind of the person satirized. I mean, this is another kind of delicate operation psychologically, I think, because it doesn't feel good to be satirized. No one likes to be made fun of. We all tend to take ourselves much too seriously, probably, and so, I think near term, probably the result of satire, typically, I think, is to harden the differences very often. And unfortunately, and this is it really has to be said. It can't be said often enough that when you're talking about resisting enemies, you're typically talking about least bad options. We're not talking about great. No one, if you find yourself in the position of having an enemy who needs to be resisted, be very unusual, for the means which will serve, to be, especially if they involve sort of sacrifice on your part, and suffering on your part. These are not going to be sort of ideal case, things you would choose for yourself or for your enemy. There is a prospect, maybe it's a distant prospect, but there's a prospect that, if someone can be made to feel ridiculous, not just in your eyes, but in the eyes of the wider public on whom they rely, for their self-esteem and perhaps their living, if they make a living writing or talking on TV or earning votes, if they can be made to feel ridiculous, there is a hope, that they. And this is a point that Augustine makes, that Pascal quotes from in the 11th Provincial, that what someone who has become committed in a very hard way to a false and dangerous proposition they don't need to be argued with. They need to be sort of shaken out of it, and satire can sort of provide the jolt, or if not the satire itself, the sort of laughter of the crowd that follows it, can provide a long enough timeline the jolt that's, will help them to rethink, these positions I've staked, or the positions, very often I think what happens too, the number of people who are really deeply committed to, the latest outrageous position that's become kind of calcified as orthodoxy, and among the great and the good, are really very few, and these groups, it turns out that determined minorities actually can very easily capture institutions. We've seen this over and over again, right? I mean, sociologically speaking, it's not an uncommon thing at all. And so an awful lot of the people who sort of nominally profess adherence to whatever the reigning orthodoxy is, do so just as a matter of getting along.
This is Havel's greengrocer that you bring up.
The greengrocer, exactly. Havel's greengrocer is the classic example of it. Yeah, the person who puts the sign in his grocery window, "Workers of the World Unite." Is that person in 1970s Czechia? Is that person really a committed Marxist? Having lived his whole life under Soviet tyranny? No, of course not. He just wants to get he wants to get the local apparatchiks off his back. And so for those people, who these are people who I think they can become enemies of the truth by default. It's sins of omission rather than commission. And these are people who are winnable, I think, if they can be made to see very clearly and publicly that the sign that they have taken to putting up in their window is ridiculous, and that what it represents is not defensible. Then there is a real prospect, I think, of winning those people over, and more. And this is honestly, and this is the reason that cultural consensuses shift so rapidly. Is that what you really have are a huge amorphous group of people, typically, who don't have strong views either way, and just sort of incline whichever way it seems like the experts incline, or the people they trust incline.
And humor can be like a shock that breaks them out of that or makes them re-examine it.
Yeah, maybe. These things, but I mean, I do conclude the essay, you might recall, by pointing out that Pascal lost this fight, and it probably ended up, he probably ended up at the end of his life subscribing to the condemnations of Jansenius that Arnaud had fled. So satire is not a foolproof, even when you engage in it responsibly. It's not a foolproof device by any means.
Yeah, it sounds like to me we've landed this discussion where if we had David French and James Wood in here and we were talking with them, it sounds like we would all agree that love of enemies is non-negotiable. It's not dependent on your situation, that being strident and enthusiastic in standing up for what you believe in against cultural and political enemies is a non-negotiable as well. That is good, as a good thing. We all agree on that. The question now is, it seems like a prudential one. It's like, when should you use sarcasm, satire, and mockery as tools in order to achieve that? And it sounds like we would still walk away with a disagreement, but maybe a little bit more of an understanding of the basic principles, thanks to, Pascal and your resourcement of his work. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. I think that's right. I found it to be a very stimulating and useful work, the Provincials, in a lot of ways, in my intellectual life, not least for this. So I hope it will seem the same way to other readers.
Well, my guest today has been Dr. Brendan Case. He's an associate director for research in the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. We've been talking about his excellent essay in Church Life Journal. It's called Pascalian Mockery as Love of Enemy, and we'll link you to it. I highly encourage you to read this essay and put it into practice in your own life. Brendan, thanks for joining me today on Upstream.
Thanks, Shane.